Hi everyone, and welcome to the First Responder Videos lecture. Let's get started. So first off, let's clarify what we mean by first responder. A first responder is the first person to arrive at a crime scene. First responders typically should have received training for emergency situations, including medical or criminal emergencies, structural collapses, natural disasters, etc. First responders may be called to the scene via 911 dispatcher, or they may discover the scene themselves during the normal course of their duties. The importance of the first responder is paramount in crime scene investigation. Every decision that they make has implications for the future case. However, because first responders are not necessarily trained forensic scientists, they may have little to no training in crime scene investigation. Now, most police academies will include a basic understanding of the crime scene investigation process, particularly with regards to evidence handling and contamination concerns. But in reality, not all police officers in uniform have received academy instruction. For instance, smaller departments that lack the budgets and staff for their own academies may only send their officers at certain times of the year. So, funny story, my stepbrother was actually employed for almost a full year as a police officer in Kentucky before he was sent to the police academy. And on his very first day by himself on patrol, he was called to a scene for a disturbance and he found a dead body in a dumpster. Bam, he's a first responder. Now, again, I cannot restate this enough. The first responder is the only one to view the scene in its pristine condition. He or she will be the only witness to enter the scene uncontaminated, and so their actions can set the stage for the entire process of crime scene investigation to come. Now, there are three primary responsibilities of a first responder, and I want to talk about those over the next few slides. The first duty of a first responder is to secure the scene. And that means that the first responder identifies any immediate threats like gas smells, biological weapons, etc. If none are present, then the first responder should go through the scene, making sure all the persons are secure and that anyone dangerous is removed. Now, this is a catch-22. Safety is the first and the highest priority. The officer can and must do everything necessary to ensure that the safety of the scene is maintained, so they can move objects, they can open doors, remove suspects, etc. But if at all possible, they should also try to avoid obvious contamination. For example, unless it's necessary, try not to drive over car tracks. Don't touch broken glass. Don't pick up objects, etc. If you have to open the door to check for a suspect, that's necessary. But opening a kitchen drawer, probably not necessary. And so that should be avoided because evidence like fingerprints and trace evidence can be lost and damaged easily. A first responder needs to be alert for hazardous situations as well, like biological hazards. First responders should make note if the scene includes drug fumes, excessive blood, has mold or other toxins, or if the scene presents safety concerns like exposed wiring or unsafe flooring. Later, investigators can bring specialty equipment and they can assign specially trained personnel to investigate the scene based on the hazards that were identified by the first responder. Now, once a first responder has ensured that the scene is safe and secure, their next responsibility is to preserve life by rendering aid to any victims or persons at the scene. A lot of times in the movies, they'll show the officer immediately assisting the victim. The problem is that if the officer gives aid before the entire scene is secure, the officer may actually be moving into a compromising position and open themselves up to danger from a suspect still in the premises. So as much as possible, the officer should make sure to secure the scene before moving to render aid. At the very least, if you have a partner, one can render aid while one can stand by to secure the scene. When rendering aid to a victim, a first responder is going to have to make changes at the scene, even if those present contamination concerns. For example, a first responder who comes across a body lying face down, they're going to flip the body over in order to check for vital signs and then to provide first aid as necessary. This type of alteration is considered distortion, not contamination. Distortion is when a scene is changed from its initial appearance as necessary to render aid. The important part of distortion is documentation. The first responder should document what they did to render aid and what emergency personnel procedures were done as well. Documentation can help the future investigators learn what the scene would have looked like originally. For example, if you had to move the victim to check for a pulse, what position was the victim in to begin with? How many people were in the scene? Were the doors open or closed when you arrive? Again, the first responder is the only one who will know what the scene looked like when they arrived. So first responders should pay attention, careful attention to their surroundings so that they can alert crime scene personnel to subsequent changes. Now, as with safety, the goal during the rendering aid situation is to render aid, but also limit the distortion and distraction as much as possible. Especially with death scenes, you're going to have a lot of people that want to enter the room. Let anyone in who's required to enter, but try to limit the gawkers. For example, let's say that the first responder found a victim who's been stabbed but still breathing. The first responder calls an ambulance, and that arrives with several other police cars and a fire truck. So now you have 10 police officers, 5 paramedics, and some firefighters at the scene. You need to provide the victim assistance, but all 20 emergency personnel do not need to be inside the room with this victim. First responders should use their best judgment about who to call and who to allow into the scene. For example, if the first responder notices that a body is in obvious stages of decomposition, they can conclude that the person does not require first aid, and they should try to protect against contamination as much as possible by keeping everyone but the lead detective or the crime scene investigator from coming into the scene. Next, the first responder should turn to establishing a perimeter. The perimeter will be a zone around the crime scene that's secured from outside persons. At this stage, the first responder may not know everything involved in the criminal activity, and so it's important to be open-minded when establishing a perimeter. Think about things like entries, exits, pathways, etc. Did the intruder come through a window? If so, then the perimeter should include that window, the area outside of it, and then also potential entry and exit routes from the window to the street or the window to another area. It's always better to cordon off a bigger area than necessary at the beginning, because you can always condense the scene if you find you've gone too wide, but you're almost guaranteed to lose evidence if you have to extend your inner perimeter to include areas that bystanders and other first responders have already had access to. Now, first responders can cordon off the area with physical barriers like crime scene tape or their vehicle, and they can use natural barriers as well, like walls, gates, and other natural barriers present in the scene. When the boundaries are established, the first responders should begin a scene log, including an entry and exit log. This requires everyone entering the perimeter to formally document their presence, including who they are and why they're there at the scene. This ensures that everyone going inside the scene is asked whether or not they actually have a reason to be there, and that helps ensure that unnecessary personnel are kept out of the scene. For smaller scenes, a single perimeter to block bystanders may be enough. For larger, more complicated scenes, consider 2 perimeters, an inner and an outer. The inner perimeter surrounds the scene itself, and that's the most important one to establish. Now, the outer perimeter is larger, and this is actually used to keep the press, the bystanders, the gawkers, everybody else away from the scene. Inside of the outer perimeter, you can set up a command center, and this is the location where all the communication and the decision-making relating to the crime scene will take place. By putting it inside the outer perimeter, you limit the number of people inside the scene itself, but you also allow for private, collected area for scene organization and for evidence collection. Now that the scene is secure, the next step and the final step is to preserve the scene as best as possible. When first responders render aid, they usually call for backup and also whatever emergency medical officers that are necessary. When the EMTs arrive on the scene, they should have full access to the victims requiring assistance. You don't have to have them sign in. However, the first responder can help preserve the scene as best as possible by identifying any important or fragile evidence and then establishing a good route for emergency personnel to take that does distort the scene as little as possible. They should also make note of who the EMTs are, what they're doing as well. What modifications are the EMTs making to the scene? It's likely that when the EMTs leave the scene, they're going to leave behind a plethora of bandages, packaging, other first aid supplies. And it's important for later investigators to know what was brought by the EMTs and what was disposed of there versus what was there originally. The first responder can use any form of documentation to preserve this evidence. So they can make preliminary sketches, they can take photographs before, during, and after. They can make mental and written notes about the actions occurring. Don't underestimate the utility of a quick cell phone snap if you want to remember what's happening. Now, another important part of the job is to realize at this point, the first responder is officially the one in charge of the crime scene. So they should remain on site, protecting the scene itself and the evidence within it as much as possible until such time as a crime scene investigator or other secondary responder comes to take charge of the scene. At that point, the first responder's role is almost done. But before leaving the scene, the first responder should provide a thorough briefing of the scene to the lead investigator, and that will include a walkthrough of the scene to identify what was done, where the victims were located, things like that. And the first responder should also turn over their notes, their photographs, and also the entry and exit log to the lead investigator. And so they should establish a method. They may not be able to give them the photos right then, but they can identify, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you the photos or videos through this method. Only once this process is completed should the first responder actually leave the scene. All right, well, that's it for this lecture. Thank you all for watching.